get for wearing a jumpsuit, even though I was told not to. Okay, so thank you, Alex, Greg, and Alfredo for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. And we have a really interesting conversation today, so I'm ready to get into it. So first question is, what does digital transformation mean to each of you? And I'll start with you, Alfredo.
Starting with me. I'm not sure about the sound here. Actually, I love how we had the transition from the technology side to human. We talk a lot about technology. It's captivating. It's really exciting what we do today, but we tend to not really look at the human side of it. But I have a question for each of you. When you look at my picture, do you guys think that's a real picture or a fake picture? Hands. Actually, that is artificially photogenic. Yes. A 12-year-old son with an iPhone 8 took the original. It was not high enough resolution, so that is an artificially intelligent picture. So we use it every day. But anyway, for me, digital transformation, it's, the bar is a little different. I tend to look at how a technology or how a business model is going to change someone's life. And I really want to see how that creates value for both sides of the equation, because that's really the only way to create something that's sustainable and valuable over time.
No, that's great. Alex?
So I focus on digital health, and I look at everything through that lens. And I think of digital transformation as you can't simply digitize systems that already exist, right? True disruption, you think about Uber didn't just give you a way to hail a cab. It allowed everyone to, monetize their car. Facebook didn't just recreate the yellow pages. It allowed everyone to be a publisher, a publicist of their own content and profile. So I tend to think of it as having to have a major paradigm shift. And in the case of digital health, I think it's especially important for that to include new stakeholders. You think about how the health system has been built and perpetuated in this country and the outcomes that we've seen. The biggest transformation that we can see is this paradigm shift towards the patient as the consumer and the democratization of access to healthcare. So a complete kind of rerouting of who the stakeholders are and who gets to make decisions.
Awesome. And I'm going to pass it over to Greg, who, by the way, everybody's got to check out his sneakers because they're really cool.
Special occasion sneakers. Yeah, thank you. Well, building on top of both of those, I love that we're starting with such a big and hairy question, like what is transformation? What is digital transformation? And I think the reality is there's no perfect definition. There's no one term. It means different things to different people and to different companies. And in fact, I think that's needed. So, I think if you look at a young sort of e-commerce or digital company that started, in the last couple of years versus a Nike that just turned 50 in May, the journeys of transformation will be wildly different. So, but I think regardless of how you define your transformation or your digital transformation, the ones that are ultimately most successful will put the how over the what. And I'll quickly unpack that. I think when you focus on the what, and full confession, I love the what as well. And the what is, what's the company's strategy? What are your work priorities? What technologies are you deploying? What problems are you solving? That to me is the what. And I think the what will continue to change at an accelerated rate forevermore. That will always change. You have to do that. The how teammates come together, how individuals collaborate, that is the secret sauce that I think folks don't spend enough time on, and that's the key to the future. So when you're able to build work relationships on a foundation of trust and respect, when you can have clarity around roles and responsibilities, decision-making rights, that's the key to the what. Then whatever the what is that comes along, the how is ready to navigate that. So I think elevating the how over the what will ultimately position you for success in whatever your journey looks like.
Okay, great. Next question, I'll just keep it with you. What motivates you personally to focus your efforts on digital transformation?
Well, I think building on the how, when you double click into the how behind a transformation, it's about the people. And that's what motivates me to dedicate my life to and my work to that type of transformation. And so I think, again, building on the people, ultimately for me, it's about one thing, in having an optimal work environment, whether it be physical or digital. How are you creating a safe and inclusive work environment? Because for me, that is, as we are all human beings, that is table stakes. And you can't even talk about what's next until you have safe and inclusive work environments, which to me looks like if any of your employees or teammates have to check a piece of themselves at the door or whatever workspace they're coming into, something needs to change. And so for me, being the change, you know, that I want to see in the world and creating that safe and inclusive environment is ultimately what motivates me on transformation.
Alex?
So, you know, I've been on Wall Street for over a decade. Have always kind of had a healthcare focus, recently transitioned to specifically focus on healthcare technology. And, you know, how I think of the world, there's no graver injustice than being denied access to control over your body, your health, your wellness, your future. And there are so many barriers that prevent people, especially communities of color, from accessing not just you know, the best healthcare, but healthcare in general. You know, very personally, I'm Mexican American. Our community suffers from a lot of chronic disease, diabetes in particular. Recently found out that the majority of my family members suffer from diabetes, and we're not communicating with each other. Weren't talking about it, weren't getting diagnosed adequately, weren't pursuing the treatment that they needed. And even controlling for the barriers, the big barriers that a lot of digital health solutions are trying to remove, you know, access to insurance, access to proximity to healthcare, right? Being in a big city versus a rural environment. There still were additional forces like stigma and, you know, fear and suspicion of the healthcare system and ability and to kind of recreate menus and dietary needs and everything of that nature that were preventing everyone in my family from both confiding in each other, you know, confiding in healthcare professionals and making those changes. And a lot of the solutions that, you know, I hope to support as a banker and an investor myself are solutions that are specifically geared towards communities in a culturally competent way that are removing those barriers so that people can actually, you know, have access to care that has major impacts in terms of well-being, livelihood, ultimately, you know, health is wealth, and your ability to function fully in society. So it's very deeply personal, but also there's enormous implications. And it's one of the ways that I think, you know, we think about tech disruption, that technology can do a lot of good. But, you know, as we had the last discussion, if the right stakeholders aren't present in the discussion, it can also potentially do harm.
Yeah, mine is actually very simple. So my mom, you know, my mom never asked me what company I worked for. She never asked me what title I had. She never asked me how much money I made. Anytime she wanted to know what I was doing, she just asked what I did to help other people. And that's how I look at it.
Awesome. I love that. Very different mom than mine. And I was going to say something. So for me, it's more about like making sure people have access, and that because I also focus on digital transformation. And so how do we create access for everyone, especially when it comes to financial literacy and focusing on that. So let's move on to the next question. It's a long one. So Greg, digital transformation is all about reimagining. I'm curious to get your perspective because I can only imagine the type of leadership that is necessary to drive that kind of transformation that impacts real change is really important. So do you think there's a type of leader or innovator that is particularly well suited to drive digital transformation? And so I know this is something you're deeply passionate about. And so I'd love for you to talk about this.
Thank you. Yeah, I am very passionate about this. I'm glad you picked up on that, and I will meet a long question with a short answer. There are 3 leadership traits that I believe are needed now more than ever. And by the way, that's not just when you're going through some type of transformation. I think these are universally important forevermore. It's authenticity, empathy, which we heard about this morning, and empowerment. And let me quickly unpack each of those. So I think authenticity is built on vulnerability and transparency, which creates trust. Empathy is built on honoring and validating the experiences of others, of your teammates. That one is particularly important if your lived experiences are different from that. I think empathy is a skill set that we can all continue to develop. Okay, so you have authenticity, which builds trust. You have empathy, which builds human connection. And then once you have that, you can come to number 3, empowerment. And so you as a leader that are now seen as a trusted, respected, and authentic and empathetic leader, empowerment comes in when you return that trust to your colleagues, your teammates, your peers, and you not only empower them and get out of their way so that they can go and accelerate the work and the impact that you're taking on, but it's actually more than that. It's getting into the trenches and actively removing obstacles from their path. That's true empowerment. So authenticity, empathy, and empowerment, I think, are the most urgently needed leadership traits today.
Yeah, in my experience, very, very similar. I would say that being empathetic is number 1. You need to understand what your team needs, feels. You need to understand what your customers value, what really is impacting them and how you can help them. The others that I think is a leader has to be highly operational. I think that it's very difficult for some leaders to really impact the rest of the team if they don't understand how their product actually creates value, what pieces of it, they may be able to take up or work with. So that tends to be something, particularly in startups, very critical. And lastly, it's that inspirational element. You have to inspire your team. You have to inspire the customers. You have to inspire the investors. And if you're not, really empathetic, really understand how to create value and able to create that level of inspiration, across the board, I think that having that set is very critical.
Okay. So Alex, you have a very interesting role. So in your role, you have a great amount of visibility into various existing technologies, as well as technologies that will be created in the near future. Generally speaking, what kinds of big picture changes are within our grasp? And maybe you can give us a glimpse of some of those technologies.
Sure. I think kind of going back to what I first mentioned around this big transformation we're seeing in healthcare through digital channels, making the patient more like how we've thought about consumers in the rest of the tech world, right? And patients sort of are starting to think of themselves the same way, that they want good customer experience, they want easy to use tools, they want tools that come to them and speak to them. I have a kind of easy little framework for when I'm evaluating digital health tools around what I think is going to be useful and successful and equitable, and what makes sense for the future. And it's, does it democratize and increase access? Does it destigmatize the health problem or health issue that it's addressing? Does it allow for customization and personalization? And is it sustainable, right? Does it have an ESG element to it? And a lot of what we saw during COVID was sort of this, kind of trial by fire and very unique environment that helped to catalyze a lot of change in the field. It changed from a regulatory perspective, as well as an adoption perspective. And a lot of the tools that we saw evolve out of that, I think, are going to be huge for allowing for these sorts of changes. So, telehealth allows rural populations to get health care. A lot of the digital behavioral tools address that stigmatization issue because you could get care in your home, you could get care in your language, you could find a culturally competent therapist if you needed to, and then tell your friends and family that you had a solution that worked. Some of these AI tools allowed for lowering costs for primary care via chat channels instead of having to go in and be face-to-face. Clinical trials, I think, are an enormous one. We talked a lot about data earlier. It's shocking, but women weren't really included in clinical trials until the 90s, right? The data is not that great. People of color don't make it into a lot of clinical trials, both due to concerns with the medical system as well as just like a bad job recruiting and giving more people access to more experimental treatments. Tech is helping to enable decentralized trials. So there are many, many different ways that all of the tech channels I think we've spoken about today and touched on are allowing for those 4 pillars to kind of be enacted, therefore giving the sort of high quality care that used to require a lot of money and social capital and access to more and more people.
Right?
Yeah, I think maybe building on that in a slightly different direction, I talked about the what and the how earlier. I think more so than the what technology is the who. And let me unpack that. It's who's making decisions on designing, building, and deploying systems, technologies, products, whatever. If you take AI, we heard from our buddy Alex earlier, and I'm so glad we have brilliant minds like you leveraging an incredibly important tool, language concept like AI, because it's remarkably powerful, will continue to be present in every part of all of our lives. And if you think about the potentially unintended impact and consequences of these things, who is behind these things is important. And I think as human beings, we are inherently flawed. We are imperfect, and that is what unites us around being human beings. And so a tool, a technology, AI is only as perfect as those that are building it. And so I think the call to action is, how can all of us, as we go back to our daily lives, not only coach, mentor, advocate, put people in positions of power, but actually give them decision-making rights around how technologies and systems are built and deployed so that we are accurately and representing our Latino and Latina brothers and sisters so that there are no unintended consequences, so that our perspective is represented from the very onset. And so that's my call to action for all of you is, who can you put in a position of power with decision-making authority that can help us build a better future?
And start building the pipeline, right? Educating people, be product managers, they help write the requirements, simple little things as well. Okay, so Alfredo, I'll start with you.
Okay. Great.
What gaps might prevent Latinos from benefiting from these kinds of changes and innovations? And how are each of you proactively working to address those issues as you develop new technologies?
Right. I've looked at the value chain and tried to be as involved with accelerators, community programs, et cetera, et cetera. To cut to the chase, the biggest gap is access to platforms where youth can create. Because we over-index when it comes to being great consumers. We're key when it comes to be early adopters. But when it comes to access, the door is shut. I have Natalie and Liz who were on TikTok before TikTok was TikTok, and Alex and Eduardo going through the metaverse before we even heard of the metaverse, and people like Mark Gonzalez who helped start the streetwear industry, $200 billion streetwear industry, Latinos. But when they raise their hand and say, I want to create, they get a hammer, they get a broom. So, access.
Anybody else want to answer that?
Yeah, I reflect the same sentiment. Again, you know, spending as much time as I have on both Wall Street and Silicon Valley, you know, I always come back to this idea that these are kind of the two poles of power and wealth creation in this country. And the lack of seats at those two tables, which decide policy, which decide who gets elected, which decide, you know, how we think about finance and health and education and climate and everything. And the lack of seats at those tables has a ripple effect everywhere else. And, you know, to Alfredo's point, the case of healthcare again, we can have all these tools, but if we don't have the right people thinking about the problems that affect our communities at the founder and the funder level, they get forgotten, right? There'll be kind of a ripple effect where because we over-index on tech savviness, we'll end up using the products that are made for, you know, the mainstream consumer, maybe, but a lot of very specific issues get overlooked and ignored, and it's especially unfortunate because, you know, as we were talking about at lunch, we're great consumers. We love technology, and we're looking for solutions, but if you don't have access to the funding and you don't have the support as a founder, unfortunately those tools don't get made.
Well, sadly, this is the end. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause to our panelists here.